magazine Monthly Review. He is best remembered for his contributions to economic theory as one of the leading Marxian economists on the second half of the 20th century. This lecture is titled Marx Misinterpreted, Revising or Revisiting the Classics, and will be delivered by Professor Dipankar Gupta, former Professor JNU. Can I please request the speaker to come on stage? This session will be chaired by Professor Jean-Joseph Boillot. Professor Boillot has a PhD in economics and social sciences. He has taught at the prestigious École Normale Supérieure and spent many years in Asia for his research on India's development model compared to China, and then as economic advisor for the French Treasury. He is currently senior economic advisor with the CEPII Research Center, with a focus on emerging countries and their impact on the world economy. Professor Boillot, can you please come on stage and take over the proceedings?
Where do you sit? Dipankar. So good morning, and thanks again to Adre for your invitation. Always a pleasure to be in Patna, the land of Chanakya, as you know. So I will be very short to present Dipankar, because the idea is to keep at least 15-20 minutes for Q&A. Some interaction would be not stupid in that event. In the social sciences, unintended consequences are outcomes that are not the one foreseen or intended by a purposeful action. This principle dates back to John Locke and was discussed also by Adam Smith, and it was popularized in the 20th century by the great sociologist Robert Merton, with his famous book, The Unanticipated Consequences of Purposive Social Action, published in 1936. Why I'm saying this? Just to introduce Dipankar. This is a Dipankar Gupta motto. Social sciences is about unintended consequences. So, we can have a discussion about Marx in terms of what Marx said, wrote, etc. But it's quite interesting to look at Marx as the unintended consequences of his writing, philosophy, and action, isn't it? So Dipankar, micro is yours. Dipankar Gupta is well known, he's a leading sociologist. He's been professor at JNU, this is where we met a few years back, shall I say. Between 1980 till 2009, he has held many appointments and fellowship in universities all over the world, in North America, in Europe, in Sciences Po particularly, and in the UK. And he has been member, and that's quite important because it's a man of action. Also, he has been member of the National Security Advisory Board in India and the News Broadcasting Standard Authority, something very important, as you know, especially today in India. So, Dipankar, we are listening to you, and then please prepare your question. Question, not comment. Please.
From here?
No, I think it's, if you feel comfortable.
No, it's just that there's a computer there.
Yeah, computer is there, and you just close the computer. Oh yes, good. Sorry, I put there. Can I close it? Huh?
One of the reasons I wanted to sit and talk, I didn't want you to see my knees knocking, because I'm a little nervous being here, not simply because of this august audience, as I say, but also because of the occasion. It's about Karl Marx, and I might as well confess right now, in broad daylight, that Karl Marx really changed my life. It changed many people's lives, but changed mine rather dramatically within a few weeks. I was 19 years old and all set to become a police officer like my grandfather and my uncle, who were my heroes. And then along came Karl Marx in my MA class, and it changed my life. And here I am. So indeed, I owe a lot to Marx, for good or bad, but I owe a lot to him. One can't rewrite one's lives in spite of the fact that there are so many things which are unintended. Even so, I must confess that I'm really, really happy and honored to be here, and it's just not a cliche I'm mouthing. I honestly mean it. Yes, sociology is indeed a science of the unintended consequence. And in fact, if you look at Marx's biography and his legacy is loaded with unintended consequences. Now, Marx would have never thought in his wildest imagination, it was unlikely, but it's also crazy, that someone like Stalin would appropriate his mantle. That is completely unintended consequence. And this unintended consequence has had a remarkable impact on the sociology of knowledge, especially when you look at it from the Marxist optic. Every great thinker is misinterpreted. In fact, everybody is misinterpreted. In the social sciences particularly so, because we speak not only in terms of denotation, but connotations too. So naturally, there's room enough for the reader to interpret things as he or she likes. Within limits, of course, hopefully. But in some cases, as we shall discover today, and this is going to be my gravamen, or my charge against some of the more recent thinkers, that their misinterpretation has been rather willful, and if I may say, with a certain tendentious slant. However, the fact of the matter is that Nietzsche had once said, very graphically as he always does, that if you have not been misinterpreted, you're really not worth it. So I think the fact that Marx has been misinterpreted so often by so many only goes to show, as Meghnad said this morning, that he is not just I think Schäuble said, he's not just a thinker and a philosopher, but he's close to being a religious leader as well. So now we have to ask ourselves that, what does misinterpretation really do? It, of course, can help those who misinterpret to open up a new avenue of thought, but often also unnecessarily calumnizes some people who don't deserve to be so downgraded. And Marx, I think, got the short end of the stick on a number of occasions. Marx and Hegel, by the way, this is Meghnad. Marx and Hegel did talk about dialectics. In fact, Hegel's understanding of dialectic was, to a large extent, very faulty, because he took it from Fichte, and Fichte's point of view was simply this, that the triad, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, was a condition of human life. You just couldn't overcome it. Every time you thought you've sort of come over a particular obstacle, there's another obstacle right in front of you, which when you overcome, there's another obstacle again. So thesis, antithesis, synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis just goes on and on, unending. And what Hegel did, and the mistake he made, was to close it with the German state of his time. And the mistake that Marx made was to close it with the socialist revolution which he thought would be coming. And by closures of this kind, what they really ended up doing is that they gave an extraordinary privilege to the dictators of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Because they could then say that here we are the ultimate culmination of history. Instead of seeing themselves as merely servers of history, they became the pinnacle of history. And I think this defect, this flaw in Hegel, followed by Marx, in the understanding of dialectic, has cost Marx dear. And that is one major unintended consequence, I'd say, of Marx and Marx's work. For this reason, that so often people who think about Marx and write about Marx are burdened by the fact that there is a Stalin, there's a Gulag archipelago, there's Anwar Hoxha, there's Ceausescu, how do you pronounce his name, of Romania, and all of these people are supposed to be those who are carriers of Marxism, which is far from true in my view. And it is because of them that we always feel this burden that if you're a Marxist, how can you explain Stalin? How do you explain Anwar Hoxha? How do you explain X, Y, and Z? And it becomes difficult. I remember when Soviet Union collapsed, somebody from the newspaper, Guardian newspaper in Britain, came to India to talk to several leftover leftists. There's a bit of a pun here. But he interviewed me, and I said, echoing Jan Myrdal, I said that now that Soviet Union has collapsed, I can again proudly say I'm a Marxist. Because till that time, it was really quite a job to stand up and be brazen about it. And because of this connection with the Soviet Union, with Bolshevism, with Gulag, with concentration camps, etc., it was so easy to downgrade Marx unthinkingly. I mean, some people just went out and did their job on Marx, and it was impossible to retrieve him. For example, someone as learned as Keynes and as respected as Keynes, it is surprising how low he could stoop to take such low swipes at Marx way below his belt. For example, in a letter to George Bernard Shaw, Keynes said that, how can I ever take this man seriously? This person wrote Capital. Because for me, the Capital and the Quran are equally shoddy pieces of work. They're dreary, dull, and out of date. He didn't mention the Bible, though, or the Gospel, or the Talmud. But the Capital and the Quran were shoddy, dreary, and out of date. And by the way, he said, the proletariats, the boorish people, boorish, barely civilized, boorish people, how can I ever identify with them? Whereas with the bourgeoisie, I can, because they're examples of high thinking. Now, this is all Keynes, and Keynes didn't have to say this. He had already made his reputation. What was the point in such exaggerations? The point simply is that people just couldn't help themselves. When they linked Marx with the kinds of dictatorships you had in the 30s and 40s and even later, it was almost a reflex action to undermine Marx as if Marx was the fountainhead of these regimes. It's a bit ironical, though, that when Keynes was talking about boorishness and the best parts of life and the most highest points of life, the bourgeoisie, what he probably overlooked was that some of the greatest artists, thinkers, and scholars in Britain were people of non-bourgeois background. I'm thinking of Raymond Williams, for example, John Keats, Alfred Marshall, the economist. They came from very humble backgrounds. And on the other hand, people who were really bourgeois, a la Keynes, such as Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, they were communist spies. Kim Philby was the son of an ICS officer. Anthony Blunt's mother, I think, was a third cousin of the Queen. Guy Burgess was an Etonian from Eton. Donald MacLean was the son of a knight, a very, very rich person. So the richest people became commies, and those who were proletariat became the sort of leaders of bourgeois aesthetics, quite defeating what Keynes was trying to say. Now, Marx has certain good things, and in retrospect, when I speak, there's certain other aspects of Marx that one has to be cautious about. Professor Meghnad Desai exhorted us to read the Manifesto, and indeed, that is one of the greatest documents that Marx has ever written. Apart, of course, from the Poverty of Philosophy, which was written in French, and French people like him would say it is the best piece ever. But you know how French can be rather partial to the language. But when Marx wrote the Manifesto, you can see both the best of Marx and the worst of Marx in the Manifesto, which is why I think we should read Marx, not simply as a text, but also in terms of self-learning and self-education. Marx, in the Manifesto, of course, in many ways, it was anticipated in the EPM, the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, not the EPW, the EPM, that bourgeoisie made tremendous strides, and that basis determines superstructure, but not in a one-way direction, because you again impact upon basis to change yourself. So this is two-way process in dialectic, perfect Fichtean thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But where Marx went wrong, grievously wrong, and where many Marxists find difficult to shake off, and that is this, that he did propound an animal theory of revolution. That as time will go by, the workers get poorer and poorer and poorer till they are brought down bare-bone subsistence, and then, unable to take this any longer, they will rise in animal-like rage and overthrow the system. Now, this is the point of view that Marx makes very, very stoutly in the Manifesto of the Communist Party. But he also says something else in the Manifesto of the Communist Party which most of us have lost sight of. And that is this, that communists should never form a party of their own. This is Marx from the Manifesto of the Communist Party. Ironical, right? That in the manifesto is said that communists should never form a separate party of their own or set up sectarian principles of their own. So if you were to use the Communist Manifesto as a charter, then straight away most communist regimes are disqualified. And not just most communist regimes, most communist parties are disqualified, because Marx did not at all advocate a separate communist party which was separate from all the other working class parties. What is more, in the Communist Party he talked about revolution, street fights, and so on and so forth, violence, but later on in the First International, Marx said nothing of that kind at all. In fact, what he was emphasizing was that communists should link with the Polish movement, with the Spanish, Italian movement, with blacks in America, and more importantly, with women. Women, he said, they are the most very, very important sort of vanguard of the people's socialist movement, because without the what you call feminine ferment, you cannot really have any kind of uprising. By the way, this is the point of view that Proudhon didn't agree, but Marx pushed on this very, very energetically, and he got it through. And as we go on with the Marxist legacy, you find Engels coming up with his introduction to the peasant war in Germany, saying that, we were wrong, we were hopelessly wrong. You cannot, at this day and age, have street fights and gun battles and hope to win a revolution. It's the age of the ballot. People are voting. There's universal franchise. We have to be able to exercise ourselves along these lines. So if you were to look at the Manifesto of the Communist Party, you'll find some great things said there, particularly how feudalism leads to chivalry and honor and things of that kind, and how capitalism, as Meghnad was saying, how capitalism brings about the notion of freedom. And freedom is so important in later developments also of social theory. But that had to be said. Somebody had to say it. And Marx said it first. Marx also said what Meghnad earlier alluded to, is that if our thinking is conditioned by our being, that is now taken as granted. Nobody even attempts to or thinks of quoting Marx. But it is so deeply metabolized in our system, we don't need to do it any longer. Now, this is the position that I think one should pay attention to. That is the good and the bad of Marx in the Manifesto of the Communist Party. But I must also add that by the time you have the capital, Marx is actually, in some ways, a very different person. In Capital Volume 1, where again I think is his last will and testament, and I think we should all see it as his last will and testament. 2 and 3 were not meant for publication, but Volume 1 is a very cogently argued piece. And in that volume, he talks about a very, very important concept which we don't pay enough attention to, but it's there. It is there looking at us, staring us in the face. It's our fault that we don't pay enough attention to it, and that is the concept of socially necessary labor. That is a very, very important concept in Marx, and only when you understand the importance of socially necessary labor will you then figure out that the animal theory of revolution, which Marx talked about in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, is now really, really dated. is gone, finished with. There are many moving parts in the manifesto, and these moving parts don't move together in synchrony, but this is one part that has to be moved out. That is the animal theory. What you instead have is the socially necessary labor, and what does that tell us? That tells us that as the bourgeois progresses, bourgeois is a very progressive force. Remember, for centuries, the armies of Hannibal and the armies of Napoleon, or the armies of Chandragupta and the armies of Tipu Sultan marched at the same pace. Along came the bourgeoisie, the railway engines, etc., etc. Today you have space flights and supersonics. So there is no point at all in trying to undermine what the great strides that bourgeoisie have made, and they made that because of this central motif, which is freedom and equality. They did it. But it also has another aspect to it, which is alienation. And this is what most people don't like about Marx's understanding of capitalism. However, the important point right now is this, that with socially necessary labor, one understands that you have to not only reproduce the body, you have to reproduce the worker in totality. So the worker is a computer engineer, you must reproduce the computer engineer in totality and not just the body of the computer engineer. So the skills have to be reproduced, training has to be reproduced, conditions of life have to be reproduced, the person's desire to save for the future must be reproduced, and all of that really goes into the notion of surplus value and not simply bodily substance. And this is something which I think is very, very important. And if Marx had been true to what he had said in terms of socially necessary labor, he need not have gone all over the place in Capital Volume 3, especially when he talks about the transformation problem. So I think that when you put in this idea of socially necessary labor as the centerpiece of Marx's work in the Capital, which in my view is his last will and testament, many of the conundrums that surround us in the understanding of Marx are gradually resolved. And what is more, if Marxist critics had paid attention to it too, they may have been kinder to Marx. However, because Marx said what he said, the 11th thesis, Professor Desai mentioned in the thesis on Feuerbach, which is philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. The idea of changing what was established is something that many found very abhorrent. And it's not just Keynes who found it abhorrent. I'm going to discuss here three other thinkers. One is Max Weber, the other is Hannah Arendt, and the third is Milton Friedman. And they all come from different specialities, by the way. One is a sociologist, the other is a political thinker, and the third is a Chicago economist. And yet they have one thing in common, and that is this visceral hatred for Marx because he wanted to change and overthrow the system. Keynes, it's a bit ironical that Keynes should have also taken that kind of a position, because he must have been looking sideways, because when Marx talked about why do capitalist crises develop, that should have actually been the launching pad for Keynes, because he then discussed how capitalist crises can be resolved. But you cannot think of how to resolve it unless you know how it came into being in the first place. So in fact, they should be holding hands and doing the cha-cha-cha together. And instead, what he did was that he attacked Keynes quite unseemingly, Marx quite unseemingly in my view. Weber, however, Weber, Arendt, and Sigmund and Milton Friedman, however, needed to attack Marx very centrally. And here I'm letting it all out, by the way, because this has been inside me for a long time, and I will not hold back. They wrote their first works, which were anti-Marxist, aimed at Marx, and on account of that first work, they made a tremendous reputation. Weber's first work was The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and he had a very disarming way about him. He said, well, his basic thesis was that his Protestant ethic is the idea that brings about material change, and obviously, who did he have in mind? Karl Marx. And what did he want to say? Karl Marx was wrong. Ideas bring about material change, and Karl Marx said material change bring about ideas. He didn't pay attention at all to either the economic and philosophical manuscripts, or to the Manifesto of the Communist Party, or to the Capital, of course. However, this is what he said. He went on to say, hold it, you know, religion is not a reflex of material reality. Who said that? Nobody said it. Nobody said religion was a reflex of material reality. Marx doesn't say it. Economic and philosophical manuscripts don't say it. The Grundrisse doesn't say it, Capital doesn't say it, even the Manifesto doesn't say it. But in the popular imagination of people, because they were thinking of Stalin, they were thinking of the Red movement in Europe, they felt that this is what Marx is about. It's such a straightforward materialist doctrine. By the way, thesis on Feuerbach was against that kind of heavy-duty materialism. But this is what Weber said, and he was applauded for it. And then Weber very disarmingly says, by the way, I'm only talking about one side of the causal chain. This is the other side as well, which is well established. That is the material side. This is the complementary part. Don't take what I'm saying too seriously. I do not want to quote unquote exaggerate the importance of what I'm saying. And yet at the end of the day, what is really saying is that ideas change material reality, which is okay. Why not? But what changes ideas? One should look at that as well, which is the point that Marx was making. Now, all of this is not innocent misreading. If you look into Weber's background, you'll find that he had this terrible antipathy towards socialist and left-wing people of his time. I'm thinking particularly of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, by the way, were killed by the Freikorps. The Freikorps, for those who don't know, they were the soldiers returning from the First World War, having lost, and they were really on the loose and kind of mercenary in character. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were killed and dumped in the river Landwehr Canal in Germany. And what did Weber say? He said that they deserved this kind of death. Can you imagine? What did Weber say also in addition to this? As a preface, Liebknecht belongs to the mental asylum and Rosa Luxemburg belongs to the zoo. This is Weber, a man who's supposed to be so, open-minded. His Verstehen approach is supposed to be so interpretive in character, so generous, so forgiving. This man, when he came to the brass tacks, was really hard-hitting, really, unforgiving, relentless in his pursuit. Then we come to, very quickly now, because he's given me a notice, we come to Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt, I must tell you, is a woman of great courage. She's a woman of great courage because on such shallow intellectual foundation, she tried to do so much. And that is really quite surprising. Do you know what she says about Marx? She says that Marx's idea of a classless society reminds me of those dreadful, messianic pictures that messianic leaders would throw up. So similar to the concentration camps and their likeness to medieval portraits of hell. Can you imagine, from classless society to medieval portraits of hell with concentration camps in between? What transition? What connection? Who could have ever dreamt it? Survival of the fittest is racism, in other words, according to her. And some people have said so. But she goes on to say, Marx is a racist too, because he talked about the survival of the best political class. The survival of the best political class, the most advanced political class, is not racism. But that's what she says. Then she says that for Marx, property is the body. If you have body and you have muscle, you have property. The more body, the more muscle, more property, obviously. You won't qualify. But, if you have that kind of thing, the property is body. Body is muscle. And these are the kinds of ways by which she tried to undermine Marx. And more than that, she said Marx was perverse. And why was Marx perverse? Because Marx didn't make out the distinction between labor and work. And what is the distinction between labor and work for those who know Arendt? It's a comical, laughable distinction. Labor reproduces the body, work produces artifice. As if a peasant says, now I'm going to labor for my family, now I'm producing corn to buy a vase. It never happens that way, but that's what she said. And can you imagine the reception she got? Why did she get the reception? Because she linked Marx to Stalin, to fascism, to hell, to purgatory, to medieval messianic messages, and she got away with it, and everybody stood up and applauded. Finally, Friedman, but very quickly. Friedman, again, his first work, Capitalism and Freedom, his first work, again, heralded him fame. Before that, nobody knew him. Before Weber wrote Protestant Ethic, nobody knew who he was. Hannah Arendt taught totalitarianism, nobody knew who she was. They all came into prominence with this first work and coasted after that quite comfortably. Friedman talked about capitalism and freedom, but Friedman never ever mentioned anywhere that Marx was the first to talk about capitalism and freedom. He didn't mention that at all. Instead, he goes on to say that Marx's idea of living labor and dead labor is laughable, which is, of course, I don't want to go into in detail, but that is not at all what Marx was talking in terms of dead labor when he talked about, you know, the means of production. However, if many people condemn Marx for Stalin, what we should remember that Friedman actually praised Pinochet. He told Pinochet that you are a wonderful man, you are a very wise person, you've identified the problem accurately. So when Pinochet came to power, the Chicago boys were in and out till in 1982, I think he eventually fired them. He just couldn't, even Pinochet couldn't bear it any longer. So at the end of the day, I'd say there is a sociology of knowledge at work, which is why Marx is appreciated and run down by people of the kind I mentioned to you. And though their criticism was so facile, and yet they won such tremendous accolades from everybody else, goes to show that if Marx had been alive, he would have probably said, not thank God I'm not a Marxist, he would have probably said, thank God I'm not a Stalinist. And the 11th thesis of Feuerbach, which says that philosophers have only interpreted the world, and the point, however, is to change it, there should be a 12th thesis. Philosophers have hitherto misinterpreted the world, and the point, however, is to change them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dipankar. Always great to listen to your culture. If you don't mind, I'll take only 5 questions. And we will start, so one microphone here on my left and the other one on the right. Where the microphone? Okay, so one question is here. Who else want to? Another one here. Please give the microphone there. Please ask your question and you will have 10 minutes to respond. Is it fine? Please.
Well, my name is Manish and I'm a college teacher. I teach economics to college students. Professor Gupta, it was a very stimulating lecture.
I think you don't need to speak so quickly. You have 2 minutes, and it's enough, no? Okay, and clear to everybody, please.
Well, I can't say that I'm a Friedmanite, but I'm a defender of capitalism and freedom. I'm familiar with his work. Well, I'm familiar with Friedman's work, Capitalism and Freedom. I'm familiar with Friedman's work, Capitalism and Freedom, which was published in early 60s, and his next book, Free to Choose, which was published in 1980. Now, when we discuss Friedman, we also have to take in account the Cold War perspective which was there. Sorry? The Cold War perspective.
Cold War, yeah.
Do you like ice cream? So you should handle your macro like eating ice cream. Is it okay? Please.
Yeah, the Cold War perspective first. And second, when, Friedman was defending liberal ideas and he was against state power, I don't think he was against Marxism per se. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
We'll take another question on the left. Please stand up so that everybody can hear you.
Thank you, sir. My name is Pradeep Chaudhary. Very illuminating lecture, sir. I really enjoyed it. Just small doubt. Do you think that there is a question of violence is inherent in Marxism because it talks about class struggle and finishing one class against another is at the core of the entire concept of revolution and social change. So how do you respond to that? Thank you.
So maybe, Dipankar, you can answer. Just I want to check who else want to take the floor so that the microphone can come to you. No? Nobody? Okay. Dipankar. Yeah. Yes, we have another one here. So bring the microphone. And who else? So that you can prepare your question. Nobody else at the moment? Fine. Dipankar.
Oritro Mujumdar here from the University of Houston. Just one quick question. With the term you mentioned that you ascribe to both Hegel and Marx, the notion of closed dialectics. What would your opinion be on the idea of negative dialectics, which in the 20th century, from Theodor Adorno onwards, seems to be like the direct response to the problems associated with closed dialectics? Yeah.
2 questions more, please. Yes, we have that gentleman. Stand up, please. Stand up, stand up. Yes. And speak on the microphone. Okay?
Okay.
And the last question, there is one more. Huh?
Can you listen?
Yes.
I'm Vijay, teach in a local college. I just have small doubt which I want a clarification. Does Marx, similar to Hegel, ends up his dialectics? What I think, he keeps his dialectics open and it does not ends up like Hegel.
Is it fine? Last comment, discussion? Wow. So I'll ask a question, the fifth one. I'm a great reader of the Manifesto, Dipankar also. But I think that what we can call Marxism today started from the Manifesto. And Manifesto is not a scientific book. Manifesto is a manifesto. It was really, I think it was written for the first international movement, no? So don't you believe?
Much before.
Oh, much before. Sorry, no. It was the Conference of London. Yeah, the Communist Party, the foundation of the Communist Party. So don't you think there is a close link between the fact that very early in his life, Marx was involved in, let's say, political action, and the rest of its work, which by and large are not much scientific work, but much more ideological work, just to prove the rightness of the ideas in the Manifesto. So that the rest of the work of Marx can be more on the side of ideology than on the side of science. And very connected to that question, as a sociologist, are you using Marxist? And what do you use in this Marxist toolbox? Because I'm a stupid guy, I have tried to use Marxism, I've never succeeded.
I'll just, can you hear me? I'll take the last question first. What have I learned from Marxism is very simple.
You can hear well?
There are many things I learned from Marxism. First of all, if I had not read Marx, I wouldn't have understood Claude Lévi-Strauss, who has been my hero for a long time. Now, the reason why I found Marxism so interesting was when I was working for my master's, not master, my MPhil thesis, which is a pre-doctoral thesis, I was kind of involved with the question of basis and superstructure, simply put. And I wanted to know, to what extent does tradition play a role in contemporary lives? And the understanding of tradition in contemporary lives led me to Marxism bang on. Because I was then able to position things like religion, family, marriage, institutions, that sort, and contemporary life, and see to what extent they have changed because of the pressures of modern times, and on account of that, how modern times themselves have changed and have become something else. So, for example, the kind of world my father faced and the kind of world I faced and the kind of world my son faces are very different from one another, simply because of this two-way interaction between, the way we live and the way we think. And I think modernity is a very good optic towards understanding all of this without descending to the level at which most people do when they discuss modernity in terms of chimney stacks and discotheques and loud music. I think the most important part of modernity is what Marx talked about and what Meghnad discussed earlier, that it forces us to look at the other person as an equal. And that is the most important aspect of modernity, and how did it come about? So if you were to ask me how did Marx help me, I think Marx helped me a great deal in opening this door. He didn't open it wide, but he opened it for me, and that was enough. The rest of it was sheer willpower. The other question was this, that the Cold War. Yes, indeed, the Cold War was very important for all of this. There was high tide of the Cold War. It was high tide of Cold War for Hannah Arendt as well. But I must say this in favor of Arendt and in favor of Milton Friedman, though I do have major problems with them, that none of them actually supported McCarthyism. They opposed McCarthyism. They said this was a wrong thing to happen. But yes, they were also victims of the Cold War. There's no doubt about it. And if you look at Friedman's first book, Capitalism and Freedom, you'll find that he very clearly says that it is communism that snaps freedom. And with communism, he was equating Marx. That was a mistake. Had he just said communism snaps freedom, I would have stood up and cheered. But that Marxism, that conflation, is what I disagree with, because as I told you, even in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which you think is ideological, even there, Marx is very, very open about his admiration for the bourgeoisie in terms of freedom and development and what they brought about. Violence, that's the point, you see, as I was mentioning to you earlier, that if you were to look at the manifesto, say, not so much in the EPM or even the thesis on Feuerbach, but in the manifesto very clearly, there is this question of violence. People have to overthrow the system. That is very much there. But as I'm looking at Marx retrospectively, I'm allowed to see him in totality. When I see him in totality, and if I were to make the claim as I do, that the capital is his last will and testament, then I think that violence does not have a place in the capital. And if I look further into Engels, there's no place at all. In fact, Engels goes out of his way to condemn gun battles and street fights. He says that is not the way in which we'll go get anywhere. And he says that we have been historically incorrect in talking about violence. So I think that Marx, taken in the round, would be one where it is not violence so much, but it is in terms of winning over the working class. You see, in the IWMA, the first international, Indian Working Men's Association, which Marx wanted to change to International Working People's Organization because he wanted women and men to have equal place. So in that, you'll find Marx doesn't talk about violence at all. In the First International, there's no talk about violence. In fact, what he emphasizes time and time again is winning over the workers. Winning over the workers is an ideological, effort. It is not through violence. So I would say that the legacy of Marx is not the legacy of violence, though there were intermittent areas where Marx did support violence. His life did give evidence of advocating violence, but when we see him in totality, he is a very different person. The dialectic. See, the negative dialectic is very interesting. It comes up because of the idea of alienation. Without alienation, you cannot really position this aspect clearly enough. And I would like to put it to you a little differently. If you were to read Hannah Arendt, for example, Hannah Arendt had a very simplistic notion of negative dialectic, which she should have actually quoted the master correctly, because otherwise her view was really odd. She said that in dialectics, I am against dialectics and muddled, quote unquote, muddled Hegelian thinking, because good cannot become bad, bad cannot become good. On this I'm adamant. Whoever said bad can become good and good can become bad is not a schoolmaster's textbook. This dialectic is something completely different. But the negative dialectic element, I think, comes up very strongly in that stream of thought in Marxism because of his linkage with alienation. Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dipankar. We are on. Always a pleasure to keep relaxed. Thank you.
Thank you.
I request Ms. Sunita Lal to present the memento to our speaker. Thank you, Professor Gupta, and thank you, Professor Boillot. A brief announcement before the next lecture.